Welcome to you all. Welcome to this last session of this mini course on Ideas 1, taught by Professor Dahlstrom. We're sorry this is the last meeting, but I hope that we have enjoyed these moments we have spent with him, and we're ready now for the last few of them. Please.
Again, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I've enjoyed it quite a bit. I've enjoyed Pisa, but I've also enjoyed talking to you about Husserl. Husserl's Ideas 1, the general introduction to pure phenomenology, has 4 sections. And the last 2 sections are entitled The Method and Problems of Pure Phenomenology and Reason and Actuality. We're not getting close to that. But the first 2 sections, we made some progress in. So the first section is called Essence and Knowledge of Essence. And there we talked about the distinction between facts and essences, and notably that the distinction is itself an essential distinction, not a factual distinction. And the way in which he argues that eidetic science is necessary for all science. So factual sciences will presuppose eidetic sciences at some level, both as formal ontology and material ontology. And then we saw last meeting his review of what he calls naturalistic misunderstandings, and most important opponent there is empiricism. The empiricism, he says, I'm not doing any philosophy here, but I do have to stop to object to empiricism because empiricism rejects ideas, essences, and eidos. So we did that, and last meeting we were able to start into the second section. And notice that it is called the fundamental phenomenological consideration. This is a general introduction, and the more I reread it, I know it's an introduction to pure phenomenology. It isn't there yet. He thinks he needs to defend essences and knowledge of essences because phenomenology is a science of essences. It's an eidetic science. Ward off naturalistic misunderstandings, but now we get to the considerations that are fundamental to phenomenology. We're not yet at phenomenology. We don't get there till after the third section. So it's 100 pages or so in this 300-page book before we get to his phenomenology proper, you might say. That's why the third section is called Methods and Problems of Fundamental Phenomenology, and it starts with methodological preconsiderations. So this is all working up to it. I think that Husserl's biggest impact has been really this section here, the second section. But if you want to talk about any of those others, I'm happy to do so. What I've planned for today is to go through much of these 3 subsections. So we'll go back to finish the thesis of the natural attitude and its suspension. And then he stops to talk about what consciousness is prior to the reductions. And the reason for that will be made clear. It's important that you establish what it is you're going to reduce. So that will be there. And then we'll have hopefully a little time to talk about the region of pure consciousness, which brings us closest to the, when he actually does the phenomenology. And as always, if you have any questions, please put your hand up and ask me questions. I'm used to having a lot of questions, and I know the language barrier is a problem, but anyway. So we saw last time that he starts out with this discussion of the natural attitude. That's actually the world of the natural attitude. and how this is the world spread out in space, endlessly becoming and having become in time. It's a world that we are conscious of immediately and intuitively, he says. In this world, the things which present themselves to us are corporeal things in some sort of spatial distribution, animals, other human beings. So in the natural attitude, I am conscious of a world endlessly extended in spatial and temporal directions. And in that world, things and people are literally and figuratively on hand or present, vorhanden. Now, I emphasized last class because I think it's just a wonderful part of Husserl's analysis, how he introduces, as part of the experience in the natural attitude, the notion of horizons. And this was the idea that there's this indefinite actuality, he calls it, of which I am dimly conscious. So whenever I'm focusing on one thing, I'm only able to focus on it because of a horizon, a context, the rest of the part of my visual field and my perceptual field that I'm not concentrating on, but I can always shift to. And then when I do that, of course, what I had been paying attention to becomes part of the horizon then. So one of the things that he does here that I just mentioned in passing a potential criticism is he doesn't specify what he means by world. It sounds sometimes like he just means the collection of those objects, okay? And you'd like to have seen a little bit more treatment of that. But putting that aside, another issue that I thought, or another theme that I thought was worth emphasizing is that he does say that this field of perception that's part of the horizon is non-conceptual. So that's interesting because he still calls it cognition. So it's a non-conceptual cognition. What's the famous line from Kant? Intuitions without concepts are blind, concepts without intuitions, or thoughts without intuitions. He doesn't say concepts again, but thoughts without intuitions are empty. Okay? So from a Kantian point of view, I'm not sure this makes sense. Maybe it does. But this is non-conceptual cognition. Now, he's not talking about, obviously, the direct perception of the cup. He's talking about that field around us. But it is a very interesting notion. So he says, to all objects which I directly know as being here and there in my surroundings, of which I am immediately co-conscious, a knowing that has nothing of conceptual thinking in it, and only changes into a clear intuiting when my attention is turned towards it, and then only partially and mostly in a very imperfect manner. Even when I turn to those horizons, I'm only going to get a partial understanding of them. And I mentioned this last class, he calls this a field of perception, and uses the expression foggy horizon. So this idea that there's a kind of dimness to it, or it's not fully articulated, it's not fully precise, it's imprecise, and it has to be. Now, there's a couple other things he says about the world of the natural attitude that we mentioned last time. It includes a world of values, of goods, and a practical world, which suggests, whether we should hold him to this, I'm not so sure, which suggests that these are distinct worlds. So he starts off by talking the world of the natural attitude, and he first mentions the things that are present to us in that world. Later in the discussion of the natural attitude, he talks about a plurality of worlds. So I'm not sure how to resolve that, but it's obvious that there's two senses of world there. The one that is at least the umbrella term for what's in the natural attitude, and then collections of things that form worlds within that. Okay. might be worth thinking about, I'll just say it in passing, whether the natural attitude is a theoretical entity produced for the sake of the phenomenology. And if those of you who know Husserl's manifest image of the world and the scientific image of the world, it has a certain echo of that there, or rather Husserl's has an echo of Husserl's. And one can ask whether what Husserl's describes as the manifest image of the world is, designed to lead to the scientific image. So one can raise similar questions with the natural attitude. Okay. That doesn't undermine it. It doesn't make it debilitating, but it's certainly a critical consideration that I think was worth some scrutiny. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to what I'm calling the qualified Cartesian paradigm. Some phenomenologists, some eminent phenomenologists, fault ideas for being too Cartesian. No question that it's Cartesian in certain respects, and he calls attention to it himself. Okay, whether that's something that hinders his analysis, his presentation, that's another matter. So, having sketched the world of the natural attitude in terms of the varieties of things given to it in that attitude, Husserl turns to, and these are his ways of talking about it, are spontaneous ways of consciously relating to those things. Spontaneous ways of consciously relating to things. This is the content of the second subsection, the cogito, my natural environment and ideal environments. So section 28, or subsection 28, begins with cogito. That obviously refers to Descartes. Husserl writes, relating to this world are complexes of the many different changing spontaneities of my consciousness, in which we theorize, evaluate, decide, act, and so on. End quote. Like Descartes, and he, again, this is not foisted on him, he embraces this parallel. Like Descartes, Husserl regards the cogito as encompassing these different forms of consciousness, with the qualification, once again, that this holds whether I direct my focus reflectively on the I and the cogitare or not. Consciousness, he says, is largely, or he implies, is largely non-reflective. Although we might want to say pre-reflective because it's capable of being reflected. Yet when the reflection is made, this is where I think he departs from Descartes. When the reflection is made, it comes with a new cogito. Now, whether that's an absolutely new cogito, that needs to be clarified. But he says it's a new cogito. Although, again, the new act of the same cogito is likely meant. But he also adds quite significantly that the reflecting cogito that emerges, quote, is on its side unreflected, and thus is not objectively for me, end quote. So not only are the forms of consciousness largely not reflected, there is a side of every cogito reflecting that remains unreflected. Now, there's a philosopher at the time who voiced a similar view, and that's Max Scheler, who said that the act of consciousness can never be the object of consciousness. Afterwards, we reflect back, or we say that it's the same consciousness. But the act itself, we're always Johnny come, that's an American expression, Johnny come lately. We come too late on the scene. So the moment we try to capture the act of consciousness, it's over. It's another act of consciousness. Okay? And it's interesting that Husserl says this, because I do think this is something that I don't recall in Descartes. I may be wrong. I recall Descartes saying anything like this. But it also shows that his sensibility to the fact that the cogito is itself limited. It's not fully transparent. Even when it does, there is a kind of reflection. It's not going to give us the whole cogito that's in the stream of consciousness. That's, I think, a really interesting point he makes there. We'll come back to this Cartesian grouping of acts of consciousness in a few minutes. So, in addition to the natural environment, there are also so-called ideal environments, in terms of which we sometimes relate not to the actuality surrounding me, but to ideal objects. And here he has in mind things like numbers, their laws, and the like. In these cases, the cogitata are nothing on hand in the natural environment. He says, quote, "The natural world remains out of consideration. It is the background for my active consciousness. My active consciousness is the natural world's always going to be there, but it is no horizon into which an arithmetical world fits itself." Now, the young lady last class or the class before challenged that possibility of keeping those two apart. Right? But he clearly states that the ideal world doesn't fit into the natural world. So we have the two worlds, the natural world and the arithmetical world, whose only connection is the ego that can freely direct its focus at one or the other. Okay. So when we talk about the environment, we have to include not only the natural environments, but these ideal environments. I was in the building here when I was rethinking some of this, and I just wondered whether the rectangles of geometry have nothing to do with the rectangular windows forming the walls around the courtyard of the schola here. I mean, it's this old question of what is the relation of the ideal to the actual. And it's clear Husserl's comes down on the side that these are ideal objects, the objects of mathematics, and they can be separated completely from the actual. Okay. Now, we aren't done. We have something else to consider here in the natural attitude. He specifies others as ego subjects who take up the same world from a different perspective, thereby accounting for an intersubjective natural environment that allows us to understand each other and commonly posit one objective world. Okay. In the fifth Cartesian meditation in 1929, and in writings as early as 1905, I think, unpublished writings, there's a clear understanding by Husserl of a need for something called intersubjective phenomenology. So one sees a little bit of it here in this paragraph. It's obviously he's concentrating on the ego here, but intersubjective phenomenology will be a prominent theme. There are some writers, I think Zahavi might lean this way, who think that transcendental intersubjectivity replaces transcendental subjectivity, that it's that strong in the later Husserl. Okay. And it's, again, this 1904 or 5, that's 7 or 8 years before he writes this. So he's already has his eye on this problem of the intersubjective, which overlaps with the problem of the role of language in the constitution of consciousness. Pretty obvious. And that doesn't get as much play as one would like to see, I don't think, in Ideas 1. Okay. Now, he says here, what holds for me holds, I know, for others, so that their environments and my environment are the same world, but taken up differently. And hence things appear differently, excuse me, from a different perspective. Quote, each has his place from where he sees the things on hand, and hence things appear differently to each of us, end quote. Yet this difference does not keep us from understanding one another and commonly positing, quote, an objective spatio-temporal actuality as our environment existing for all, end quote. I don't think that excludes extreme differences that defy that supposition it's the same world. But in general, I think he's on safe ground saying this. But I don't think we want to say that it's unqualified, that, you know, there wouldn't be cases where people couldn't come together in the way they perceive the world. But that's the claim made here. All right, so we've got things and animals and humans in the constitutive intersubjective sense. We have ideal objects. This is all part of the natural attitude. So then he turns in sections 30 to 31 to the general thesis of the natural attitude. And in the subsection, he calls it radical alteration. And this is very controversial, so I'm going to go a little slower here. If you have problems with it, you're not alone, but please feel free to raise questions. So when he comes to this subsection, the thesis of the natural attitude, he says that the foregoing subsections of this chapter are a piece of description prior to all theory. Yet he has no intention of systematically and comprehensively characterizing what is found in the natural attitude. So you could have a systematic, comprehensive account of all those kinds of things which we've seen are part of the natural attitude. And he says this is a necessary and important task. You should do this. But it's not his aim here. Instead, the point has been to clarify in a sufficiently ample way the general characteristics of the natural attitude, namely the general thesis that, quote, as an actuality, the world is always there, end quote. Even if at times in a way other than I suppose. So could be illusions, there could be hallucinations, but the world is always there in some sense. The goal of sciences in the natural attitude is accordingly to know this world more comprehensively, more reliably, and more perfectly in every respect than naive experiential information can. There's a naive natural attitude, and then there's the sciences that are built in the natural attitude. This is perfectly legitimate. This is a good thing. He also adds that the natural attitude is not a single act or judgment, though the latter may be based upon it, making explicit what already lay unthematically, unthought, unpredicated in the original experiencing. So it's a matter of making explicit what is already there. Hence, it is more of a potential thesis, the natural attitude, than an actual one, because we saw it included all those horizons. We turn to those, we make explicit what has not been thought about. We thematize what was given to us unthematically in the original experiencing. So the point there is that we shouldn't think of the natural attitude as just a one-time thing. It's an attitude. It covers over a whole series of acts. It becomes a kind of habit. We think of the world as composed of all these things that present themselves to us laid out in space and time. Now here, Husserl invokes Descartes' approach. Just as Descartes recognized it's always possible to attempt to doubt everything, albeit for the sake of setting up an absolutely indubitable sphere of being, so Husserl proposes a universal doubt, albeit only as a method for different purposes. Thus, he rescinds, he pulls back the thesis that things exist, which is part of the natural attitude. Not in the sense of claiming that they do not exist. This is the trick. Not in the sense of claiming that they do not exist, but simply in the sense of putting the thesis out of play. Okay? So it's soccer, it's foosball, and this is the soccer field. And when the ball goes outside, it's out of play. Not part of the game anymore. Okay? That's what the suspension of the natural attitude is, putting it out of play. He says we are perfectly free to do this. We are able to doubt, quote, anything and everything. And so here you see why people read this introduction of phenomenology as a Cartesian introduction. Now, he says that this modification is peculiar, sui generis. It does not transform the thesis into the antithesis, whereby we would be giving up the thesis. But he says, this is not a long quote, we do not give up the thesis that we have posited. We alter nothing in our conviction. Ball is now outside the field. It's still the same ball. So the conviction remains in itself as long as we do not introduce new motives for judgment, which is precisely what we do not do. Nevertheless, it undergoes a modification. While it continues to remain in itself what it is, we place it, as it were, out of action, we suspend it, we bracket it. The German for suspending is like turning off the lights, ausschalten. And einklammern, the word for bracketing is putting in parentheses, einklammern. Okay, is still here as before, like the bracketed in the brackets, like the suspended outside the context of the suspension. So he again stresses our capacity to modify this thesis of the natural attitude toward things generally. He says this re-weighting or re-evaluating, Umwertung, is a matter of our utter freedom and stands in contrast to every manner of taking up a position in thinking. It's different from any other way of taking up a position in thinking. Nor is it, he stresses, to be identified with simply thinking to ourselves, which need not entail any such suspension, and indeed can be equivalent to assuming or presupposing. So it's not the same as simply making assumptions or presupposing. That's a little delicate, that distinction between assuming and this bracketing. But anyway, to illustrate what he has in mind and the significance he attaches to the expressions, turn off, out of play, bracket, suspend, we'll consider the role of a parenthetical remark. I read one recently and online. It may have been, anyways, a group of analytic philosophers had a blog. They were making fun of continental philosophers because continental philosophers use brackets. So what the hell? Say what you want to say. Don't keep putting brackets here, stopping the flow of the discussion. Okay, there's something to that, obviously. But the role of a parenthetical remark is to interrupt the flow of a sentence, adding useful but not essential information to what is conveyed by the sentence itself. Of course, if it is not just incidental, you shouldn't be putting it in brackets. It should be part of the regular sentence. So the senses of a bracketed and an unbracketed extension are the same in one respect, different in another respect. Okay? And this is a little bit like the difference between bound and an unbound variable. The unbound variable would be x is f. The bound variable is there is something that's f. Okay. What are we suspending when we suspend the natural attitude? We're suspending the claim that things exist. We get rid of that. We have the unbound variable. So it's at least one way to make sense of what he has in mind here. Very similar to this. The moment you put, at least when I used to teach logic, if you put an A here, now that's no longer unbound because A stands for a name. This is just something is F. But we're not saying that it exists yet. We're just entertaining the attribution of F to something. But something like that is going on here with the suspension of the natural attitude. Notice that the suspension of there exists at Fx The suspension of bound variable doesn't give us, it's not the case that there exists XF. That would be to transform the thesis into the antithesis. But we're not doing that. We're entertaining X is F, independent of the claim that it exists or it doesn't exist. So the suspension of there exists an F is equivalent not to, it's not the case there's an F, but to X is F simply. As Husserl puts it, the reduction consists in, quote, a certain withholding of judgment that is compatible with the unshaken and even unshakable because evident conviction of the truth of the judgment. So you can be completely convinced of the truth of the judgment, but if you're going to do phenomenology, you have to suspend the claim that it exists. Okay, so this introduces the last subsection of here of thesis of natural attitude and suspension, and this is the phenomenological epoche. He says that a universal epoche or withdrawal of commitment to the assertion, in the sense described, replaces the Cartesian universal doubt. But it is not an unlimited universality, since it is directed precisely at the discovery of unmodified sentences of a new scientific domain. One that is, this is a quote from Husserl, one that is supposed to be attained precisely through the method of bracketing, but then only a specifically restricted domain, end quote. So Husserl's proposing that we bracket the world given in the natural attitude and all the sciences based on it, but without denying the world in the manner of solipsists, because it's still in the brackets, nor doubting its existence in the manner of skeptics. So he precisely wants to differentiate this from the appearance of solipsism or skepticism. Instead, he says, I completely close off any judgment based upon spatio-temporal existence and suspend all sciences related to this natural world accordingly. So that is what's so important. The fundamental phenomenological consideration begins with what the natural attitude contains, what it includes, what it encompasses, and then the nature of its suspension. Okay. Is that fairly clear? Any questions or comments? Yeah. Okay. So now we would think, well, now we're ready to go. Let's go. Let's do this. And we don't. This is the way he operates. Now we're going to turn to consciousness and natural actuality prior to a suspension or a reduction. Okay. Why do we have to do that? Well, we have to know what we're bracketing. We have to have an account of our bracketing. So we have to articulate what consciousness is. And that's what he spends a lot of time on in this next subsection, consciousness and natural actuality. I guess one virtue of this, I think it's really a virtue, is you cannot be interested in phenomenology and want to understand consciousness. And Husserl gives you an account of consciousness here. I mean, it's metaphysically loaded, but nevertheless, he gives you an account of it that is before we get to the task of the phenomenological reductions. Okay, so he starts here with a preview of this. He says, what remains if the entire world, ourselves included, is suspended? The aim, Husserl says, may be designated as that of gaining a new region of being, one that has not previously been circumscribed in its distinctiveness, and that, like every authentic region, is a region of individual being. So once again, besides in the introduction, he's convinced he's doing something new. He's exposing a new region of being. It hasn't been done before. People haven't recognized consciousness in its distinctiveness as the core to the subject matter of phenomenology. So since the being in question is pure experience, pure consciousness, and all that involves, correlates and ego, Husserl proposes to begin with consciousness as it is given in the natural attitude. Okay? So now we're going back in a way. After we've been told we're going to perform these reductions, first he's going to give an account of what is reduced consciousness. He says, in the widest sense of the term, the expression consciousness covers all experiences. We are in the natural attitude as we are, even in our scientific thinking. We take all these advanced findings of psychological reflection as real occurrences in the world, precisely as experiences of animal beings. Okay. So the study of consciousness and natural attitude, it's a psychological reflection on real occurrences in the world, experiences of animal beings. Okay. He's going to counter this tendency to think of consciousness this way. And to do this, he proposes we keep our sights focused firmly on the sphere of consciousness and study what we find immanently in it. But we're going to do that without yet performing the reductions. So he says, in these studies, we go so far as is necessary to achieve the targeted insight. The insight that consciousness in itself has a being of its own that is not affected in its absolute essence by the phenomenological suspension. It accordingly remains, after we perform the reduction, as a phenomenological residual. So the reduction, there will be something left. We're going to see that it has to be left even when we take a look at consciousness in the natural attitude. So after the bracketing, there'll be something left, the phenomenological residuum. The analysis of that is phenomenology, as phenomenology is the new science of what remains when we have bracketed the natural attitude. And he says, only by means of this insight will the phenomenological epoche deserve its name. The fully conscious implementation of it will prove to be the necessary operation for making pure consciousness, and as a further consequence, the entire phenomenological region accessible to us. Precisely by means of this, he says, it will become possible to understand why this region and the new science coordinated with it had to remain unfamiliar. Why didn't people see this? Why didn't people recognize this? Well, he thinks he's going to be able to explain that. And of course, that will take us performing the reduction. As long as the possibility of the phenomenological attitude, this goes back to the first book, natural attitude and phenomenological attitude. As long as the possibility of the phenomenological attitude was not recognized, the phenomenological world had to remain an unfamiliar world, a world scarcely divine, scarcely thought about. No idea. So I'll just put a little outline on the board, and then I'll go back to where he gives us his account of consciousness. So something like this is going on here. There's the natural attitude. And in the natural attitude, we have, using Cartesian language that he likes, we have cogitationes. And that term is actually very useful for him, because later we're going to distinguish between noetic and noematic phenomenology. So this includes both the cogito, doing some thinking or doing some kind of cognizing, and the cogitatum. So I think, or I have some conscious act, the nature of that conscious act directed at what it's conscious of. I think, thinking, the thought. So there's already, we see a structure here to consciousness that we have to be able to articulate. It gets more complicated than that, but that's the general idea. Now this, in the section we're going to be reading, going over in the next half hour or so, this is consciousness within the natural world. So what needs to be done is this needs to be bracketed. So I bracket the natural world. I get rid of the natural attitude, and then I have this phenomenological attitude. But this is why he has to first talk about consciousness at length, because it's the same consciousness at some level in the natural attitude and the phenomenological attitude. So the bracketing of this within the natural world, we're still going to have the cogito, the cogitans, and the cogitatum. Now, once we have bracketed it, what we get is the phenomenological residuum. So that's in general terms what's going on here. He's trying to articulate what consciousness is so that we can bracket it, and then we can have what's left over once we've set aside the thesis that in the natural, everything is part of the natural world, it exists in the natural world, and analyze the essence of consciousness. Never forget here, we're talking about phenomenology is going to be the intuition of essences. So there's going to be an essence to perception. There's going to be an essence to imagination. There's going to be an essence to thinking. There's going to be an essence to dreaming, which is going to involve some kind of structure like this. We're going to see that there's a limit to that, but in general, that's what's going on here. To put it another way, when I know something, the object known and the act of knowing are necessarily combined together. They form an essential unity from Husserl's point of view. It can't be a contingent unity if it's knowing. Okay, so I hope that might have been helpful. Now I'll talk a little bit about Husserl's appropriation of Descartes here. So he says, this is very explicit in section 34, he's going to consider the essence of consciousness prior to the epoche. So he's told us about the epoche in 32. Now put it aside, forget it for a while. Just follow me on what I'm going to say about consciousness is. And he writes the following: as our point of departure, we take consciousness in a sense that is concise and initially affords itself a sense that we designate most simply by means of the Cartesian cogito, the I think. Once again, that appealed to Descartes. We are familiar with the fact that it was understood by Descartes so broadly that it encompasses every I perceive, I remember, I imagine, I judge, feel, desire, want, end quote. And thus, every similar kind of experience of the ego in the midst of innumerable fleeting particular formations. We leave out of consideration the I itself, to which those formations are all related, or that lives in them in various ways. The I that is active, that undergoes this or that is spontaneous. So he sets that aside for now. He does come back to it, of course. And we have mentioned already that in the investigations, there was not a commitment to an identical ego. By the time he writes Ideas I, he's committed to it. And the Cartesian ego cogito, part of the reason for appropriating him is there is the ego always there. Although some people criticized Descartes early on for that, right? Does the cogito ergo sum imply the I am or just cogitans. Okay? But Husserl will is appropriated in the sense that it includes the strong notion of an identical ego. Okay, he also adds here, we consider the experiences of consciousness in the entire fullness of the concreteness with which they surface in their concrete connections, the stream of experience, and into which they fuse together through their own essence. Okay. So there's this understanding of the stream of consciousness, that at some level, ground level, we have a stream of experience, and what concretely is part of that stream are experiences or partial experiences that are necessarily tied to one another. That'll be different for different experiences, but that will be the case for each of them. Each experience that the focus on reflection is capable of targeting has an essence of its own that is to be apprehended intuitively. So each experience of the stream has an essence of its own that is to be apprehended intuitively, a content that can be considered for itself in its own distinctiveness. Okay. So again, he has his eye on the ball. I mean, he has his eye on it's phenomenology being an eidetic science of experience. What matters is apprehending this content proper to it, the content of the cogitatio, so he uses that cogitatio, in its own pure distinctiveness and characterizing it universally. By accordingly excluding everything that does not lie in the cogitatio according to what it is in itself. So the idea, I guess, there is that when we consider perception in itself, we don't have to posit the existence of what is perceived. We may do that. We may want to do that. We may say we have to do that. But once we've made the reduction, we're considering the essence of perception without that claim, because that's part of the claim of the natural attitude that we bracketed. So too, it is necessary to characterize the unity of consciousness that is required purely by what is proper to the cogitationes. It can't be your brain, can't be your behavior, it can't be the language you learned. These would all be contingent empirical ways of talking about the unity of consciousness. We have to talk about the unity of consciousness purely in terms of the cogitationes. Okay. Now, I mentioned last time how impressed I am when I reread Husserl on this notion of the horizon and the environment. And there's another passage that's like this that comes up. I'm going to read a little bit as he turns to consciousness, again, under second subsection. Just by the way, just to keep in mind what's going on here. This consciousness, this and here is misleading. Because it's consciousness, as we're going to see, the Cartesian reference should suggest this to us, is going to be what is not part of natural actuality, is contrasted with natural actuality. There are all kinds of things happening in my brain right now as I watch that mosquito under the lights. But my seeing the mosquito under the lights, okay, is not part of natural actuality. Or there's some way in which it is part of my consciousness. It can't be reduced to what's going on in my brain. So there is a dualism of a sort here in the background. And he thinks that an analysis of consciousness is committed to that. There's a lot at stake here. Okay, the next section is the cogito as act and the modification of it. So I'm going to read this little quote from him. He writes, "Before me, in the dim light, lies this white paper. I see it, touch it. This seeing and touching of the paper in perception as the complete concrete experience of the paper lying here, and indeed of the paper given exactly with these qualities, appearing precisely with this relative lack of clarity, in this imperfect determinacy, in this orientation to me is a cogitatio, an experience of consciousness. The paper itself, with its objective makeup, its extension in space, its objective place relative to the spatial thing that was called my body, is not a cogitatio, but instead a cogitatum. Not the experience of perception, but instead the experience of the perceived. This is a common refrain from Husserl, okay? Seeing blue is not blue. Imagining red is not red. We have to distinguish the act of perceiving from the object perceived. And we make a mistake when we collapse them and attribute to the act of perceiving what is true of the object perceived. So the paper itself, with its objective makeup, is not a cogitatio, but instead a cogitatum. Not the experience of perception, but instead the perceived. Now, something perceived can itself very well be an experience of consciousness, but it is evident that something like a material thing, for example, this paper, given in the experience of perception, is intrinsically not an experience, but instead a totally different kind of being. The paper itself is not a cogitatio, it's a cogitatum. To go back to this title of this chapter here, the subsection, the paper is part of natural actuality, the perceiving of it's part of consciousness. And they're totally different kinds of being. And a good part of this subsection is to explain why we need to think that. We need to think that they're two different kinds of beings. In generally perceiving something in the sense of becoming aware of it, I am turned to the object, for example, the paper. I apprehend it as this entity here and now. The apprehending is a taking out from, since everything perceived has a background that is part of the experience. Around the paper lie books, pens, inkwell, and so forth. They are also perceived in a certain way. They are perceptually there in the field of intuition, but while I'm turned to the paper, they dispense with any such turn to them and apprehension of them, even in a secondary way. They appeared, and yet were not taken up, posited for themselves. Each perception of a thing thus has a halo. I think the German there is Hof, courtyard. That's often translated horizon, but it's not even in the German horizon. A halo of background intuitions or instances of background seeing. And that too is an experience of consciousness, or more succinctly, consciousness, and to be sure of everything that lies in the objective background that is also seen. It is self-evident thereby that we are talking neither about what is objectively to be found in objective space that may belong to the seen background, nor about all the things and occurrences of things that experience may progressively and validly establish there. We are talking here exclusively of the halo of consciousness that pertains to the essence of a perception enacted in the mode of turning toward an object, and further what lies in the distinctive essence of this halo, this background itself. Okay, he says this entails that a certain modification takes place of the original experience, so we freely shift the focus. But this is not exactly in merely the physical focus, but instead the mental focus, from the paper first focused upon to the objects that were already appearing prior to this, but were only implicitly, of which we were only implicitly conscious. So this is, again, a way of thinking of the cogitatio, cogitatum. The cogitatum includes this halo, this horizon. It isn't just the individual object you're paying attention to, but it's what allows that object to present itself to you from out of a field. That's part of this cogitatum. And I mean, he's saying it rather dogmatically, but he's saying here, obviously that field that makes it possible for an object to stand out shouldn't be identified with objective space. Not the same as objective space. So there's a point of, you may argue with him on that, but he's very clear about that. Okay. Now, there's a certain terminology he uses here about actualization. So the things on the desk here that you weren't paying attention to when you were fixated on my cardinal's cap, you could always turn off your attention to the cap and turn it to your attention to these other things. He calls that non-actualization, and obviously the paying attention to the cap is an actualization. But he also makes some interesting remarks in regard to that. It obviously holds for all such experiences that the currently actual experiences, seeing the cardinal's cap, are surrounded by a halo of ones that are not currently actualized. The stream of experience, he puts this in italics, can never consist of just actualizations. We're always going to have this contextual, horizontal, implicit consciousness of a background for the things that we do concern ourselves with. Precisely the latter, universalized in the widest sense, so the non-actualized, and contrasted with what is not actualized, determine the precise sense of the expression cogito. I'm conscious of something. I carry out an act of consciousness. In order to keep this fixed concept sharply separated, the concept of the non-actualized from the actualized, we will reserve the Cartesian terminology cogito and cogitationes exclusively for the actualized, and unless we explicitly indicate the modification through a modifier such as not currently actualized. Okay. So this is pretty pervasive, this stressing of the contextuality, the horizontality of these non-actualized moments. Again, the stream of experience, so consciousness is the stream, can never consist of just actualizations. Okay. Okay. He says it is, without exception, part of the essence of each currently actual cogito to be consciousness of something. Okay. So this is that intentionality we talked about, we saw with Brentano, introduced the concept of intentionality. We're going to see that Husserl will not buy into the Brentanian universal view of intentionality in a moment, but here he introduces it. In its manner, according to what was previously elaborated, the modified cogitatio is equally consciousness, and consciousness of the same thing as the corresponding unmodified consciousness is. Hence, the universal essential property of consciousness remains preserved in the modification. All experiences are also called intentional experiences. Insofar as they are consciousness of something, they are said to be intentionally related to this something. So the idea there, I guess, is that there's an intentionality both at what you are explicitly focusing on and perceiving, and an intentionality for that background. It's consciousness of something on both levels. And that's why you can switch back and forth. And when you switch back and forth, it turns out to be the same object. Okay. Now, here's where he splits with Brentano. And he's confusing here because he just said that all forms of consciousness are conscious of something. Now you can say, well, not exactly. But anyway, I don't think his general view is undermined by this. So he does not consider every experience to be an intentional experience. He writes, one easily sees that not every real inherent aspect in the concrete unity of an intentional experience possesses itself the basic character of intentionality. the property of being consciousness of something. So notice how he puts it. Not every real inherent aspect in the concrete unity of intentional experience. So when you see this cap, you see red. So that's a real inherent aspect of the unity of that intentional experience. Red's part of the object, and seeing red is part of the seeing of that object. This applies, he writes, for example, to all data of sensation that play so great a role in the perceptual intuitions of things. In the experience of the perception of this white paper, more precisely in the components of it related to the quality of the white of the paper, we find the datum of sensation white through a suitable shift of focus. We don't look at the cap, we look at the red. This white is something belonging inseparably to the essence of the concrete perception and belonging as a really obtaining concrete integral part of it. This is maybe unfair here, but this is kind of like the pineal gland, because the seeing of red is, when he uses the word real, he means as part of the psychological event in nature, and that means also involving all the neural characters of it. There's the real inherent, really obtaining concrete part of the perception is the seeing of red. He uses the word white here for his example. As a displaying content for the white of the paper, the white that appears, it is a bearer of an intentionality. So the white of the white paper is a bearer of intentionality, but not itself a consciousness of something. And color bears an intentionality, but it is not a consciousness of something. You see the cap, and when we say we see red, we're not using see in the same way, because the red is part of what is animated, this is his language, to see this object. Red is part of the object, and red is part of the experience of the perceiving, but the experience of the red itself is not the experience of something to which it's directed. So the perception is a perception of the cap. Seeing red doesn't have to be related intentionally to anything. That's the claim. Now, he adds in the next sentence, precisely the same holds for other data of experience, for example, for so-called sensory feelings, pleasure, pain. Those are also non-intentional experiences. So the idea here is that you could have pleasure and pain be part of a perception, but the pleasure and pain, or pain itself, doesn't have that intentional character. So again, intentional here always means it's a consciousness of something. So the perception is a perception of an object that presents itself spatial-temporally to my sense powers. But the perception is not the same as those sensations. So sensations have a difficult status for him and for all the early phenomenologists. Let's go back. We talked about this the first day with Brentano. Are your pains consciousness of something? In the way that your perception is a perception of something. Husserl thinks there's a difference. Now, Brentano, as we said, he tries to solve this problem by saying pains and pleasures are intentional by virtue of the fact that they localize the pain or the pleasure. But that's kind of an odd sense of intentionality, given that intentionality is the consciousness of something that the consciousness is directed at. Or at least Husserl, and he agrees with Stumpf here. They both disagree with their teacher, Brentano, on this point. There's the expression that Husserl introduces in the fifth logical destination. a feeling sensation. And he with Stroop argues that these are not intentional. So there's a limit to the claim that intentionality informs consciousness. Not all forms of consciousness are intentional experience, according to Husserl. I've got a little chart on this, but you get it. I mean, there's intentional experiences, actual and potential, actualized, non-actualized. Intentional experiences, they're perceptions of objects. And then there's non-intentional experiences, the data of experience, colors, difficult to even say the experience of the color. And then there are sensory feelings, feeling sensations like pleasure and pain. Okay. Anybody want to talk about that any longer? Should we move on? I've been teaching a book, and Alessandra's been teaching it too, by Peter Goldie on emotions. And part of the book is trying to argue that the attempts to reduce emotions to beliefs and desires in conjunction some way gives us an adequate account of emotions. And Goldie argues against that. He says, no, we have to add this feature called feeling towards. And he realizes it's a hybrid because it's trying to give intentionality to the emotion. But it's interesting how difficult it is to pin down, to give a description of feelings. I mean, the idea that there's something called feeling towards that's non-conceptual, it works for some things, to be sure. You could say love or anger. Does it work for pleasure or pain? And even if we did say it worked for love or anger, how is the feeling towards not dependent upon the beliefs and desires, so that it just becomes a place mark for the beliefs and desires about what I'm angry about or what I'm attracted to. So, okay, well, feelings are tough. Feelings are difficult things to talk about, and we see it here too. All right, so having glossed this distinction between intentional and non-intentional experience, this is section 36 under consciousness and natural actuality. Husserl makes another delicate distinction. It's a distinction between the intentional experience and the focus of the ego on the object of the experience, or on what is perceived, imagined, and thought. So there's a distinction he wants to make between the intentional object being directed at the object and focusing on the object. And having made that distinction, he then notes that the intentional object of evaluation entails a value that is not itself apprehended. Instead, what is apprehended is something that possesses the value to apprehend, possesses the value. So so that the old Shakespeare sonnet, why do I love thee? Let me count the ways. So you love him or her, but you don't know why you love him or her, or you haven't thought about why you love him or her, or you haven't thought about what is lovable. So there's a distinction here he makes between the intentional object of evaluation. You love something, or you consider something good, but you don't necessarily apprehend what is lovable or what is good separately. You presume you know it. Obviously, you say, I love you. Okay, that means you're lovable in some sense. But you can say you love someone, and that's an intentional act without objectifying and considering, well, what is it that's lovable such that I love this person? And the same thing with, say, something is good, or something is just. You can use those modifiers without objectifying what it is that's tied into with that valuation. So he makes this point in section 37. In the act of evaluating, we are turned towards the value. In the act of joy, towards what is enjoyable. In the act of love, towards the beloved, and so on, without apprehending any of that. The intentional object, the value, the enjoyable, the beloved, the hoped for, is only made into an apprehended object in a unique objectifying term. So you have to turn from the I love you to, well, what is lovable about you? This is an objectifying term, as he puts it. Okay, there's more, but I'll leave it aside. One thing we mentioned this when we talked about this, I think the first or second day, he distinguishes here the mere subject matter. So in order for me to love her, I have first to know her or be conscious of her. So I go from that mere subject matter, person I'm relating to then the full intentional object, which would be the object of my loving. Okay? So there's the full intentional object, which includes the act of valuing, presupposes a non-valuing act. So you perceive X, and then you take a position towards X and say, I'm attracted to X. And then you could, if you wanted to be a philosopher or a psychologist, say, well, why am I attracted to her? So you got that third level. He's spelling that all out here in this section 37. In every act, a mode of attentiveness holds sway, yet wherever it is not simple consciousness of a subject matter, wherever an additional consciousness of taking a position towards it is founded on such a simple consciousness, the subject matter and the full intentional object, so the subject matter and the value, come apart, or we can consider them apart from one another. So there is he talks about this at the end of the ideas. He has the notion of an axiology. It isn't really articulated in ideas 1, but here we see how that would develop, in what direction he would be able to develop that. I'm going to just do one more thing, and then we'll take a break. Husserl, having made this distinction, between attending to something, simply attending to it, and recognizing or valuing it, he introduces the notion of reflection on our acts. While we do not have a cogitatio as such in our attention, so right now, whatever you are doing, it's a cogitatio, but you're not thinking of the cogitatio. It's unreflected. So he makes the claim that it can always, while living in the cogito, the cogitatio can always be made into such an object through reflection. So this intrinsic possibility of a reflective shift of focus is an essential property of it. That also is obviously important when we reflect on, well, why do I love you? Or why do I consider this good? So the reflection has to be there. We have to ask ourselves, well, what it is about us that has that intentional relation, and on what basis. But he introduces something else here that's really important for the rest of the argument, and that is that when we reflect on our perceptions, we see them divide into two essentially different groups. And they are called immanent perceptions and transcendent perceptions. This is crucial for much of what follows. Immanent perceptions are those that are essentially such that their objects, if they exist at all, belong to the same stream of experience as they do. They belong to the same stream of experience as the perception. So my act of deciding to walk over here when I did is part of the same stream of consciousness as my act now of talking to you. Okay, so that my perception of the decision to come over here 10 minutes earlier or so was an imminent perception. Belongs to the same stream of consciousness as the experience of perceiving that act, to remembering that act. Okay. Transcendent perceptions, by contrast, are perceptions whose objects are essences, acts belonging to another stream of experience. So if I somehow can perceive, what are you looking at me that way for? What are you thinking? Okay, that would be a transcendent perception. I'm trying to figure out what you're thinking about this lecture or whatever. So experiences belonging to another stream of consciousness, and things, realities in general. These are transcendent perceptions. So what he's going to do now is go into some detail on what makes for the difference between the immanent perception and the transcendent perception. And that will make it possible for him to explain why consciousness is different from every natural actuality, and why consciousness has a kind of absolute necessity to it that natural actuality does not. So a lot will turn on this distinction between immanent and transcendent perceptions. Okay, I'll stop there for a little while. Can we get back a little after 7? Good. We go to 8 tonight. We could stop earlier, but sure. Yeah, okay. So we'll take a little break. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that would be an attempt to on both sides. So the person who sees the person looking through the keyhole, what do they experience? And what the person who looks through the keyhole experiences. No. The person who sees that person is having a transcendent perception. The person who feels shame at being seen is the immanent, because the feeling of shame is part of the same stream of consciousness as the realization, oh, someone's seeing me. That makes sense?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that works.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So you're in the choir?
Yeah.
Oh, good for you.
Thank you for your help.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Thank you for coming.
He said that there is an ambiguity because intentionality of feelings, there is a relation between that he can but there is also a response of the object that affect myself. So intention is the object, but the object is the thing that make me feel.
Yeah, the lady is just here, or man, person who just was talking to me, brought up Sartre's.
Thank you.
Non so perché adesso si sente.
Sì, sì, si sente, adesso sì.
Sì, adesso
Prima
sì,
era
adesso
stato
sì.
tolto il microfono.
Ma per quanto
Grazie.
tempo è stato silenziato il microfono?
Negli ultimi qualche
No.
minuto.
Ah,
Durante
ok.
la pausa, ma non è stato riattivato.
Non sono stato io, forse si è disattivato da solo per il prolungato silenzio. Grazie.
Benissimo.
Okay, I'll start again. So at this point in this section, Husserl appears to pause. He titles this subsection "Consciousness and Natural Actuality," the same as the entire section. And he pauses to ask how consciousness can mesh with the world and yet have an essence of its own, given that both seem to transcend one another. So there's a sense in which the world is not reducible to consciousness, and there's a sense in which consciousness is not reducible to the world. He writes, our natural waking life as an ego is a constant perceiving, whether it be currently actualized or not. The world of things and our body in it are always perceptually there. How then are consciousness itself and what it is conscious of, the perceived being, separated from one another, the former as a concrete being in itself, the latter as something opposite consciousness and in and for itself? How is this possible? It's a good philosophical question. He said they seem to need each other, and yet they seem to be different from one another. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but there is a section that follows that is more or less a scientific realist position. So he introduces primary and secondary qualities, and talks about the fact that science dispenses with the secondary qualities. So Husserl grants that this is possible, that the appearances, the experiences could be explained by science, but he makes the claim here that science would still rely on a description of the experiences. It would rely on it, in fact, even for its purposes of verification. So it's an interesting little aside there that he adds. Yeah, okay, I'm going to jump ahead. So the next section is entitled Being as Consciousness and Being as Reality. Intrinsic differences in the manners of intuition. And he introduces this section as follows. One result of the reflections that we have just completed is the transcendence of the thing over against perception of it. And as a further consequence, its transcendence over against any consciousness that relates to it at all. This is the case not merely in the sense that the thing is not to be found factually as a really obtaining component of consciousness. Rather, the entire state of things is an eidetically discernible one. As a matter of unconditioned universality, he says absolutely unconditioned universality, no thing can be given in any possible perception, in any possible consciousness at all, as immanent to it in a real manner. A fundamentally essential difference thus surfaces between being as appearance and being as thing. That's really sharp. There's a fundamentally essential difference between the two. So the claim here is that the thing that is perceived cannot be given to consciousness if we understand consciousness as a psychological event in nature. That's the I don't know if we want to call it extreme, but that's the powerful claim that's being made here. So no thing can be given in any possible perception, any possible consciousness as immanent to it in a real manner. So obvious examples of what's really immanent would be your feelings or your sensations. Okay? You have them, I don't have them. You have a stream of consciousness, I don't have them. The cap doesn't appear in consciousness like the feeling or the sensation. And he's claiming it can't be given to any possible consciousness where we're talking simply about what is really inherent in that psychological event as part of nature. The term real in Heidegger's or Husserl's language here is that, and real here means what pertains to the act of perceiving as part of the physical nature of the perceiver. So whenever you see that word real, it means it adheres and somehow it's a modification or property of the physical nature of the perceiver. The difference between immanent and transcendent perceptions, got that? The difference between immanent and transcendent perceptions lies in the intentional object. In the one case, immanent to the perceiving is really obtaining in it, again, the color you see, the feelings you have, they really obtain, they are inherent in your act of perceiving. They are without profiles or shading. You see this cap only from this angle, a certain angle. If you want to see the whole thing, it's got to be, you got to look the back, you got to turn it around and so on. You don't do that with your sensations or your feelings. So he has this notion of profiles, the word, and somebody just translated adumbration, but the objects that we perceive that are transcendent to us in the world present themselves to us in profiles. But our sensations and our feelings do not. So there's a difference between the way things are given in immanent perceptions, no profiles, they're given adequately, and transcendent perceptions, they're given in profiles, and you're always going to see only one side of it at a time. That doesn't mean you don't see the thing. This also is insistent upon this. You see the thing itself. There's no thing behind the thing you perceive. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. But you only see it partially. You only see it inadequately because you have to see it from a certain perspective. You don't have that problem. This is maybe a Cartesian leftover. You don't have that problem when it comes to your immanent states of mind, the immanent contents of your consciousness, like your feelings and the sensations. Okay. We perceive things by virtue of the fact that they present profiles of themselves, according to all the determinacies that in a given case are actual and that genuinely occur to the perception. So We perceive things by virtue of the fact they present profiles of themselves. Then he immediately says, an experience, a cogitatio, does not present itself in profile. It is not a contingent, peculiar sense of the thing or a contingency of our human constitution that our perception can get to the things themselves only through mere profiles of them. Okay. All right, I think I'm going to read his text. Things as such are incapable of being perceived immanently, and thus found in the connection of experience, meaning the cogitatio, the consciousness. This incapability is an essential and wholly intrinsic property of things as such, and of every reality in the genuine sense. Thus, the thing itself is said to be itself transcendent and unqualifiedly so. In just this way, the intrinsic differentiation in the manners of being manifests itself. The most cardinal difference at all, that between consciousness and reality. So you see, the title of this section was Consciousness and Natural Actuality. What he's trying to say is, look, the way things are given to you transcendently can never be given as part of consciousness, as a part of consciousness, in the way that what is immanent to your consciousness can be given. So there's going to be a radical difference between consciousness, consciousness of itself or of its contents, and its consciousness of things outside it, external to it, that transcend it. Because these will always present themselves in profiles. They'll never present themselves in a fully adequate way, unless we say God perceives in profiles, and then God perceives all the profiles at once. He does bring that up a little later in this section. So there's this distinction between consciousness and reality, or consciousness and natural actuality, and he thinks he's found the basis of this distinction, and that is in the different kinds of givenness of what is transcendent and what is immanent. So there's a difference. This is a defense of a kind of a Cartesianism, at least with regard to epistemology. There's a difference between our access to our own consciousness, the contents of our consciousness, and the contents of what we perceive that is outside our consciousness, not part of the stream. Inherent to this contrast between immanence and transcendence is an intrinsic difference in the kind of givenness. This is Husserl. Immanent and transcendent perception are not only distinguished by the fact that the intentional object is in the first case immanent to the perceiving in the sense of really obtaining it, and in the second case not. They are distinguished even more through a manner of givenness. We perceive the thing by virtue of the fact that it presents profiles of itself, and an experience does not present itself in profile. So you can see here why Husserl is described as a Cartesian phenomenologist when it comes to ideas. He says he's insisting on this distinction. But he's kind of a realist, because the perception of the external world, of the things that present themselves in the natural attitude, are given in ways that are intrinsically different from the ways in which my own contents of consciousness are given for me. And that difference is, this, again, this matter of profile, difference in profiles. So things are perceived as they are in themselves, because how they are in themselves is how they present themselves to you. But you never fully, you don't see all sides of the thing. You can't when it comes to transcendent perceptions. Okay, now there's a section 43, which is really interesting. And I'm glad I have an expert on imagination in the rooms that I can appeal to. It's called Clarification of a Fundamental Mistake. And this is vintage Husserl, and I mean vintage because it's in logical investigations too. So it's titled Clarification of a Fundamental Mistake. and it follows this differentiation of manners of givenness of transcendent and immanent perceptions. He actually has two mistakes in mind. The first mistake is to think that there's a thing behind the thing perceived. Who seemed to tell us that there was a thing behind the thing perceived? What philosopher? Yeah, Kant, right? I mean, the things in themselves. Right? Noumena are not phenomena. They're not things as they appear. Whether there are, what the status of things in themselves is a great debate, but Husserl is clearly differentiating himself from that. So one of those two mistakes is to think that there's a thing behind the thing perceived, or that there is a perspectiveless perception. There's a perception that is non-perspectival. That is to say, a perception that is not a perception of something in profiles. So here's the quote from Husserl. What I gave you is just a précis. He says, it is therefore a fundamental mistake to suppose that perception does not get at the thing itself, or to suppose that the thing is not given to us in itself and in its being in itself. So too, it is fundamentally mistaken to suppose that it is possible in principle to intuit every entity simply as what it is, and specifically to perceive it in an adequate perception affording the thing itself in person without any mediation through appearances. On this supposition, God, the subject of absolutely perfect knowledge, and thus of every possible adequate perception, naturally possesses what we finite creatures are denied, knowledge of the thing in itself. So Kant does have this doctrine of divine intuition as a divine creation. So this view, Husserl declares, is absurd, that you can have a perspectiveless perception, or that there's something behind what is perceived. But then he suggests why people think this. So the clarification of a fundamental mistake is also an attempt to talk about what's the source of the mistake. And this is where I think we get the vintage Husserl. It's because they fail to discriminate between immanent and transcendent perception. They collapse the two, entailing that a spatial thing would itself be an experience, co-belonging to the stream of divine consciousness and experience. What leads them into this mistake, this failure to discriminate between immanent and transcendent perception, is an analogy, a misleading analogy with pictures or signs. Misleading since both are themselves already transcendent in some way. He writes, in these kinds of presentation, signs and pictures, we intuit one thing in consciousness so that we may depict or significatively indicate something else. So a sign is a sign of something else, a picture is a picture of something else. By contrast, in the immediately intuiting acts, we intuit something itself. It's a mistake to try to build perception on a picture theory or a semiotics. That's the claim. That's what I meant, vintage Husserl. Perception is irreducible to imagination for Husserl. Perception is irreducible to any kind of semiology. So by contrast, in the immediately intuiting acts, we intuit something itself. No higher level construal builds on the construals in these acts. Hence, we are not conscious of anything for which the intuited could function as a sign or picture. Oh, this is my cup. There's water in it. There's a thing behind there that it pictures. What? It's a sign of something behind it. No, I'm perceiving the cup with the water in it. I'm not perceiving a sign of that or a picture of that. And the fundamental mistake is to think that I could explain perception by appealing to some kind of picture theory or fantasy. So this it's a very short section, actually. Section is it 40? Did I say 43? Yeah. The clarification of a fundamental mistake, but it's an idea that he had early on and carries with him, this irreducibility of perception to other mental acts. The spatial thing, this is Husserl, the spatial thing that we see is, along with all its transcendence, something perceived as it is in person. It is something given consciously. No picture or sign is given in place of it. Placing a consciousness of signs or pictures at the base of perceiving is illegitimate. He makes a similar point with regard to the difference between perception and memory or free fantasy. He writes, in the perception, the same thing is still characterized in the distinctive manner of being in person, in contrast to the modified character of having it in mind, having represented it in memory or free fantasy. One stumbles into an absurd position if, as so often happens, one mixes up these manners of presentation. So the way something's presented to you in the flesh, in person, and the way it's presented to you in memory, or the way it's presented to you in free fantasy. That, he says, you stumble into an absurd position if you mix up these distinct manners of presentation. Okay. That's all I have. I have a lot more on this section, but I want to touch on the region of pure consciousness with you. That'll have to end it. A few things to say about it. Again, I won't keep you too much longer. So the region of pure consciousness, he begins by describing the natural world as the correlate of consciousness, and that natural world can be thought not to exist. This is where after we've had this emphasis on transcendent perceptions, the perception of the things in themselves, it's kind of a realist direction. Now we're pulled in the other direction, more of an idealist direction. Everything that composes it, the natural world, are what they are only as things of experience, the latter lending them their sense. While we in fact pass beyond intuitively given things and positive physical truth is underlying them, this does not have to occur. Not only did mankind not have to move beyond the pre-scientific stage, and not only could there have been another sort of physical world, but it's also conceivable that the world as we intuit it is the ultimate, behind which there is no physical world at all. We can go further in mentally destroying the objectivity of things. What things are? They are as things of experience. Husserl writes, quote, experience alone is what prescribes to them their sense, and to be sure, since it is a matter of factual things, the actual experience is definitely ordered combination of experience. Now, the idea that the world may not exist sounds crazy, right? And he actually says in the next section, he entitles it The Logical Possibility Yet Material Absurdity of a World Outside Our Own. There's no logical contradiction to the assumption of a world outside ours, or that it doesn't exist. Hence, the formal logical possibility of reality outside the one spatial temporal world fixed by our actual experience proves to be materially absurd. So I guess the idea is we can't imagine that, but it's not off the charts logically. But in keeping with the suspension of the natural attitude, we can suspend the idea that the world or things must exist. So he says that absolute consciousness is the residuum, so that's that word again, residuum of world annihilation. Existence of a world is the correlate of certain manifolds of experience set apart by certain essential formations. It's possible that those experiences are able to present things only in such forms of connections. it is thinkable that there is no longer a world. The being of consciousness of each stream of experience in general would, to be sure, have to be modified by an annihilation of the world of things, but not affected in its own existence. Thus he uses this expression, the Latin, nulla re indigit ad existendum. No real being is necessary for the being of consciousness. This is what I said, this is clearly an idealist tilt, and people see this as a kind of idealism, that consciousness does not, in principle, require the existence of the world outside it. It needs a world, because there'll be the world after we bracketed the world of natural attitude, that it forms part of the background for the things we perceive, but it doesn't have to exist. And that's part of the phenomenological reduction. So he says, this is a famous line, it would be absurd to think that the corresponding transcendent world does not exist. At the same time, quote, between consciousness and reality, there yawns a veritable abyss. In the latter case, a self-adumbrating being, never presenting itself absolutely, so everything presents itself only in these profiles, never fully adequately, merely contingent and relative, doesn't have to present itself to us, it may not show up, it may pass away. But in the former case, in the case of consciousness, a necessary and absolute being, in principle, not to be given through adumbration and appearance. So our consciousness is not presented to us in profiles. It's presented to us adequately and immanently. So while consciousness considered in itself is a context of absolute self-enclosed being, capable of neither causing nor being caused by any natural thing, the entire spatio-temporal world is merely intentional being, as far as its sense is concerned. In other words, it has the merely secondary relative senses of a being for a consciousness, end of quote. So I'll end with a little chart that just makes this point. I find this incredibly challenging to make sense of this, to hold it together. And yet I could see why he's led there. So he's got on the one hand, consciousness. And on the other hand, reality or transcendent nature. This is an immanent being, and it is absolute. This is a transcendent thing, made up of transcendent thing, and it is consciousness dependent. This is necessary. Again, I think that necessity goes back to that appeal to the Cartesian doubt. Can't doubt that I'm doubting. Something necessary, even if I doubt the existence of the whole world. There's some immanent consciousness that can't be doubted. So there's something necessary to consciousness. And it is non-adumbrative. It's a hard word to use, but no profiles. Things are presented imminently and adequately. Whereas over here, things are, as we heard him say, self-adumbrating. Actually, a nice way to put it. The things themselves present themselves to us in profiles. Okay, so coming from the things, and they're contingent, relative. And lastly, this is not positive. Whereas this is positive in the sense that it is a being for consciousness. So I don't know if that's helpful to you, but that's this section entitled Consciousness and Natural Reality is aimed at establishing the difference, the intrinsic difference between consciousness and transcendental and reality or transcendent nature. Now, one last point. The next section is called the phenomenological attitude and pure consciousness as the field of phenomenology. He recognizes that this is an inversion of the common talk of being. What was first absolute and independent is now secondary, relative, and dependent. So he writes, now it becomes clear that in fact, opposite the natural theoretical attitude, the correlate of which is the world, a new attitude must be possible, which, despite turning off this psychophysical nature, retains something, the entire field of absolute consciousness. Instead, therefore, of living naively in experience and theoretically researching what is experienced, sciences of the natural attitude, the transcendent nature, we carry out the phenomenological reduction. So we get, through the phenomenological reduction, we get the phenomenological attitude and access to absolute consciousness. So that's how the second chapter of Ideas One unfolds. What comes later is the next section will be about the different kinds of reductions there are. So we'll have to suspend existence, to suspend God, have to suspend certain sciences. It turns out we can't suspend the phenomenologist's ego itself, and so on. But that all is a spelling out of the phenomenological reductions. But they presuppose this contrast between consciousness and natural actuality. That's it. I think I'm going to stop. Is that okay? But I'm open to any comments or questions or yes.
I don't know if this makes sense in this way, but do you believe that in ideas there's, on the basis of this difference between immanent and transcendent perception, there is really the idea of consciousness as absolutely self-transparent and immediately given to itself? Because in the development of this thought, I believe that the idea of Selbstauslegung as a kind of an infinite task, this set a limit to this idea. But maybe
yeah, that's a great question. So there's a number of philosophers who, following G.E. Moore, and I think it also is, I think it's also Hamilton, I forget which. But anyway, they have this notion of transparency of consciousness. There was a guy at Princeton in the 60s. He also got his name. Anyway, and now Moran at Harvard has this view. And this is the idea: it's transparent, meaning that there's nothing to see, and you can only tell what the person's conscience is by the beliefs they subscribe to or claims they endorse. I mean, I don't think I don't think that can be right. And I think this text, in the ways it outlines different forms of consciousness, give us a way to respond to that. But it doesn't give you some common feature of all the forms of consciousness, I don't think. And so there is a difficulty there. And that may play into the need for an endless question, as you suggest. So then we get into questions about consciousness as a task and the role of the will. But I can't say more. Could you want to say more about it? Yeah.
You know, because in my mind, I was thinking about, for example, Ricerche's objection of the self-transference of consciousness, because it is more of a task. But in Husserl, I was thinking about the fact that when we pay attention to the temporal structure of consciousness itself and the stratification of different levels of sense in consciousness itself, of course, with phenomenological analysis, you can disentangle these layers and know consciousness, but this is not something immediate or actually given. It is a task that's continuous.
Yeah, but so let me play devil's advocate, but just for the sake of discussion. So is the task given to something? Is it a task for something? And if it is, isn't that consciousness? But that doesn't answer our question what consciousness is. It just says that there's a task that is given to it. But this is where we're back to this, I think, puzzling problem with consciousness. I mean, we could say that, you know, perception and imagining and thinking are all forms of consciousness. But what are we saying if we can't identify what is common to them? I mean, what Husserl has given us is an account of the structure, the contents of different forms of consciousness that a lot of contemporary philosophy doesn't want to talk about because they think that it is ultimately transparent. So there, I think he's very helpful, but I do see there's still a problem there. The other thing that I think is particularly interesting about this chapter that we've spent most of today on is the extent to which Husserl has laid out why consciousness is irreducible to things presented to us in what he calls transcendent perception or external world. I think a lot of that's plausible without accepting the whole machinery. So I think this chapter in particular is useful for philosophy of mind. What is consciousness, and whether one has to affirm its irreducibility to natural actuality. So I guess that, yeah, I'll stop there. But that's a really good question on the task part. In the role of Rudolf Bernet, he used to say that this is a major Husserl scholar at Leuven Archives for many, many years. He used to say that the secret to Husserl is Schopenhauer. And that's because of this, that there's some kind of volitional character that underlies it. I mean, I've never been able to establish that, or haven't followed it up in great detail, but I can see why one might want to go that way. And that's where the task character might show up. Okay, well, thank you all. Sorry I stopped a little early here, but I'm tired. But I recommend, I actually purchased the Italian. It's next to my bed at home. Didn't bring it with me because I was going to borrow Professor Florence, but I ended up not having time to do that. But I definitely recommend reading this book. It's a powerhouse. Again, just the descriptions of consciousness that he gives, they're so rich. You may not want to follow the machinery that he develops out of it, but boy, there are insights left and right going there. So I would recommend it, definitely.
Is anybody from home willing or ready to make one comment, ask a question? If not, then let's thank Professor Dahlstrom.
Thank you.
For these wonderful classes. People are clapping. See,
Oh.
it's just an image.
Yeah, but I perceive the image.
Oh, Gabriella, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I wanted only to catch myself. I'm
Okay.
sorry. Thank you very much for your wonderful lessons. We had to learn a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much for attending. It's great. Thank you.
So thank you all. Now I will interrupt the recording. One thing that I might, before I do so, just I would like to remind everyone and people who are also listening remotely from home that we have some few appointments next coming up on June 10 and 11. We have a conference on Hegel's psychology. And on that occasion, we will also discuss and present the commentary to Hegel's psychology that I and some of the people present in the room have put together. At least Guglielmo, Danilo, yeah, but then also other people that you know. On the 12th and 13th of June, Angelica Nuzzo will give 2 lectures on the end of the world, on the 12th in Kant and on the 13th in Hegel. That, as far as I'm concerned, brings that to a close for my first year here at the Scuola Normale. The invitations and the guests that I've had the pleasure to invite and bring here. So thanks.
If anyone has a question that occurs to them later, my email is publicly available. I'm happy to talk to you, or I'll respond. So feel free to address me if you would like to.
Professor Dahlstrom is, in a sense, I'm also a bit sorry that you didn't really take advantage of him, because he's very open to questions and he loves to engage in discussion. You have caught a glimpse of that. Also, he takes questions seriously, and that's not something that's that common in academia. So if you find people like that, jump on them.
Well, just right meeting.
Well, yeah, metaphorically. Okay, all right. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Ciao. I learned that.